The Bible gives you 7 words about Barabbas after he walked out, and he released Barabbas to them. After that, silence. No record of where he went. No account of what he carried. A man walked out of that courtyard holding something that had no name yet. And the text let him disappear. History kept the miracle. History didn't keep the man. 2,000 years of preservation, and what survived was the moment of exchange. The crowd, the choice. The name called out across a courtyard full of people who had already decided. Not the person who walked through the gate on the other side of that decision. Not what his legs felt like. Not what he did when the walls of the city opened up around him and no one was watching anymore. Jerusalem, Passover. Somewhere around 30 AD, a man named Barabbas was released. Convicted insurrectionist. Convicted killer. The text gives us that and moves on. That person, the one who kept living after that line, is who we're here to find. There are questions about these ancient accounts that no sermon, no commentary, and no documentary has ever asked out loud. Not because they're inappropriate, but because they require a different kind of attention. That's what this channel is. Subscribe now and be part of a community committed to asking the questions that most people walk past. The question he carried out of that courtyard, the one no text ever stopped to ask, is the only question this story was ever really about.
He released Barabbas to them. That is the last sentence the text gives us about this man. 7 words. After that, nothing. No follow-up, no name reappearing in any epistle, any gospel, any early church record that has survived. For a first-century reader, this line would have required no explanation. Everyone in Jerusalem knew who Barabbas was, or at least knew the category of man he represented. The Greek word used in the gospel accounts, lestes, carries weight beyond simple criminality. It was the word used for armed insurgents, for men who killed Romans or collaborators, or anyone who stood in the way of what they believed was liberation. Barabbas wasn't a common thief. He was a man of violence with a political cause. Under Roman provincial law, crucifixion was the standard sentence for insurrection. It was designed to be public, prolonged, and deliberately humiliating. A message to any watching population about the cost of defiance. Barabbas had been caught. He had been sentenced. The mechanics of Roman execution were not slow or uncertain. He was a dead man waiting. The custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover, referred to in Latin scholarship as the privilegium paschale, is documented only in the gospel accounts. Roman sources from the period don't corroborate it directly, which has led to considerable scholarly debate. What the accounts agree on is this: Pilate offered the crowd a choice, and the crowd, organized and vocal, chose to release a convicted insurgent over a man whose offense was theological rather than military. Whatever Pilate's calculation was, and Roman governors were skilled political calculators, the result was a transaction that made no administrative sense. He released the one Rome had every reason to keep. He executed the one who posed no military threat. Barabbas walked out. Picture what that moment looked like from the inside. He had been in Roman custody long enough to know what was coming. The courtyard of the Praetorium was not a place men left. You were processed, condemned, and assigned a date. Barabbas would have known this. He had watched other men go through this sequence and not return. And then something changed. The voices outside. The name being shouted. His name. In a way he could not have anticipated. Not pleas for his execution. not the crowd confirming what the Roman administration had already decided. The crowd calling for his release. When the soldiers came for him, the news would have taken a moment to understand. Not because it was difficult to hear, but because it was impossible to integrate. He was being released, not pardoned, not exonerated, released. On the back of a crowd decision that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with someone else. He walked out of that building into the noise of Jerusalem during Passover, one of the most densely populated weeks in the city's calendar, when hundreds of thousands of pilgrims crowded the streets, the temple courts, the narrow alleys of the lower city. He walked out alive, and somewhere behind him, the man the crowd had traded for him was still in that courtyard. The text preserves that sequence as fact. What it does not preserve, and what no commentary in 2,000 years has fully sat with, is what that sequence felt like to the man at the center of it. He didn't ask to be released. He didn't negotiate. He didn't earn his freedom in any conventional sense. A crowd of strangers chose his name, and a Roman governor complied, and a man he had never spoken to absorbed the sentence that had been written for him. There is a concept in several first-century Jewish theological traditions for this kind of transfer, the idea of one life standing in place of another. Barabbas would have been familiar with it from the Passover ritual itself, from the sacrificial system, from the texture of the world he had grown up in. But knowing the concept and standing inside it are not the same thing. He walked through the gate. The city received him, and the question that would follow him for the rest of his life, however long that was, wherever he went, had already been born in that courtyard. What do you do with a life that was given back to you by someone you didn't choose? That question is where this story actually begins. The accounts end there. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all four record the exchange. None follow Barabbas past the gate. He is one of the most dramatically positioned figures in the entire Passion narrative. The man who was literally substituted. The man whose freedom was purchased, in the most concrete sense, by another man's death. And the text gives him one line and releases him. That silence is not accidental. The writers of these accounts were not concerned with Barabbas's inner life. They were recording a theological event, the sacrifice, the substitution, the culmination of a narrative arc that had been building for centuries. Barabbas was a detail in that larger story, a necessary contrast. But Barabbas didn't experience himself as a detail. He was a man. He had a history. He had a cause he believed in enough to kill for. He had people who knew him. He had a body that still needed to eat, to sleep, to move through a city that had just handed him back his life without asking his permission. The speculative record begins here, in the gap between what the text needed him to be and what he actually was. First-century Jerusalem was a city of approximately 80,000 permanent residents, swelling to several times that number during Passover. A released prisoner had no infrastructure waiting for him, no institutional support, no ritual of reintegration. You walked out and you figured it out. What Barabbas figured out, or tried to, is the question we're about to follow. And the first hour is the hardest part of the answer. He didn't go back to wherever he'd been before. That much is almost certain, not for safety reasons alone, but for psychological ones. The places that existed before Roman custody belonged to a different version of himself, a version that was supposed to be dead. The streets of Jerusalem during Passover were simultaneously the worst and best place to disappear. Worse because they were dense. Every face was a potential witness, a potential connection to who he had been and what he had done. Best, because in that density, a single person could become invisible within a block. Pilgrims from Egypt, from Babylon, from Rome itself, from dozens of provinces. They moved through the city without knowing who he was, without caring. Barabbas would have understood this geometry. A man who had survived as an insurgent understood the value of crowds. He would have moved through the lower city, most likely south of the temple complex, where the streets were narrower and the population more layered, more anonymous. The smell of Passover preparations was everywhere. Roasting lamb, smoke from hundreds of household fires, the particular thickness of a city cooking the same meal at the same time. The ordinary life of the city pressing in on all sides. He had been in Roman custody. He didn't know exactly how long. He didn't know the full shape of what had happened outside, only the result. His name had been called. He had been released. He didn't know yet what had happened to the other man. That knowledge would come. Jerusalem, during Passover, was a city of accelerated information. News traveled through the temple courts, through the market stalls, through the water carriers and the merchants and the women at the wells. Within hours, he would have known. The man who had been traded for him had been crucified, was dying or already dead on a hill outside the city walls called Golgotha. And here is the first question that follows him through those streets, the one that wouldn't permit him to keep walking without a reckoning. Did he feel relief? Because the honest answer is probably yes. The human body responds to survival with relief before it responds with anything else. He was alive. He was free. Whatever was happening on that hill was not happening to him. The first layer of the afternoon was simply alive. But underneath that layer, and this is where the ancient world is not so different from the present one, was something that had no name yet, something that relief couldn't fully cover. He had not asked for this. He had not chosen it, petitioned for it, earned it, or been present for the decision. A crowd of strangers had shouted his name, and a Roman administrator had complied, and a man whose name he may not have known yet had absorbed the sentence written for him. The theological concept of substitution, one life standing in for another, was not abstract to a first-century Jew. It was woven into the language of Passover itself, into the imagery of the Lamb, into the collective memory of a people whose central historical identity was built around a night when death passed over them because something else absorbed it in their place. He had grown up inside this language. He had prayed with it. He had probably fought because of what it demanded, that the liberation his ancestors had been given should extend to his present generation, in his present city, under this present occupying power. And now the language had become literal in his own body, not as theology, as fact. What no category could absorb, what no framework was large enough to hold, was what it felt like to be the specific man on the specific afternoon. Because relief runs out. The first hour ends. The second hour arrives, and then the third. And then the darkness comes. And in the darkness, a man who has been given back his life has to begin the work of figuring out what to do with it. That work had no clean starting point, no ceremony, no instruction. Just a city, and a man walking through it, carrying something the city couldn't see. The problem with survival is that it doesn't stay simple. The first layer is biological. The body's relief, the unclenching of muscles that had been braced for execution. That layer is real, and it matters. But it doesn't last. Within a day, perhaps two, Barabbas would have encountered the full weight of what had happened. not as abstract theology, not as political calculation, but as the specific, irreversible fact of it. A man died in your place. Not because of something you did, not because of some transaction you negotiated, because a crowd shouted your name and not his. Because a Roman governor needed to manage a situation, and you were the instrument that managed it. Because something happened in a courtyard you were not part of and could not undo, and the man who died. This is what makes the afternoon of Passover in Jerusalem unlike any other substitution in recorded history. Was not a soldier, not a criminal, not someone the world had already accounted for as a life likely to end violently. He was, by every account that survived, a man who had done nothing to earn that cross. This is where the cost begins to speak. For an insurgent, a man who had built his identity around resistance, around sacrifice for a cause, around the willingness to accept death as a consequence of conviction. The concept of someone else absorbing that consequence was not heroic. It was structurally destabilizing. What does a man like Barabbas do with a debt he cannot repay? This question, what happens to a person after something like this, isn't only ancient. It's happening right now in different forms to real people. Has something ever happened to you that changed everything? And the hardest part was what came after? Leave it in the comments. This community is here to listen, because the debt was real, not a legal one. Rome had cleared the administrative record, but the kind that lives in the body, in the space behind the sternum, in the moments just before sleep, when there is nothing left to distract from the weight of what happened. The kind that cannot be discharged through any institutional process, because no institution created it. He was free, and he was more bound than he had ever been in Roman custody. The days that followed would have pressed on every existing structure of his life. The network he had been part of, whatever cell of resistance had survived into the weeks after that Passover, was now operating in a city that had just executed one of the most publicly visible men of that week. Roman presence was heightened. Temple authorities were managing the political fallout. Word was moving through the Jewish community about the man on the hill, who he had been, what he had said, what his followers were now claiming about what happened on the third day after his death. Barabbas would have been moving through all of this, invisible at the center of an event that no one around him knew he was at the center of. And the specific pressure of that invisibility is something the ancient world and the present one share completely. To carry something that changed everything for you, and to carry it alone in a city that doesn't know you're carrying it, is one of the most isolating experiences available to a human being. He was alive. He was free. He was in debt to a dead man whose name he was only now fully learning. And the question of what to do with that, the question survival always eventually produces, was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. The early Christian community in Jerusalem was small, but it was not invisible. Within weeks of the crucifixion, the accounts describe a group of followers, several hundred at first, then growing rapidly, who were publicly identified with the man Jesus had been. They met in homes, in the temple courts, in the streets of the lower city. They shared meals. They spoke openly about what they believed had happened. They were a presence the city was aware of. Barabbas would have been aware of them too. This is speculative, but not unreasonably so. First-century Jerusalem was not a large city by modern standards. The events of that Passover were not a minor footnote in the city's social memory. They were a disruption that everyone processed and discussed. A released prisoner moving through the same neighborhoods would have encountered the aftermath of that disruption in ordinary ways. In conversations overheard at market stalls, in arguments near the temple courts, in the changed behavior of people he had known before his arrest. At some point, and this is the pivot the speculative record allows us to follow seriously, Barabbas would have had to make a decision about the information that was accumulating around him. Not a theological decision, not a conversion, not a public confession. Something more internal and more fundamental than that. A decision about whether to keep moving forward as if the exchange had not happened, or to stop, to actually stop, and let it mean something. The insurgent's instinct would have been to keep moving. That was survival strategy in its most practical form. You don't look back. You locate the next cause, the next operation. You convert grief and disorientation into forward momentum, and you don't permit the weight to accumulate. But grief accumulates, whether you permit it or not. And here is the historical and theological context that matters in this moment. The concept of being ransomed, of having one's life purchased by another, was not foreign to Barabbas's world. It was woven into the annual rhythm of Passover itself, into the imagery of the sacrificial lamb, into the collective memory of a people whose central historical identity was built around a night when death passed over them because something else absorbed it in their place. He had grown up with this language. He had prayed inside it for his entire life. And now, the language had become his personal history. The moment the speculative record suggests as the turn, the point where the direction of this story shifts, is not dramatic in any cinematic sense. It is quiet. It is the moment when a man who has been running from the weight stops, turns, and faces it for the first time without the buffer of motion or distraction. There is no tradition, no legend with any historical credibility that places Barabbas inside the early Christian community. The silence is total in that direction. We are not telling a conversion story. What we are following is something more fundamental and more universal than conversion. We are following a man who encountered the most radical version of a question that every human life eventually produces. Not what do I believe, but what do I do with what was done for me? That question arrived for him somewhere in Jerusalem, in the weeks after Passover, in a city still vibrating with the aftershock of what had happened on that hill. It arrived in the dark, without ceremony, the way the most important questions always arrive. And it asked something of him that no political cause, no insurgency, no framework he had ever operated inside had prepared him for. It asked him to receive something, fully, without deflection, without the protection of either rejection or explanation. Just, someone died in your place, and you are still here. What are you going to do with that? There is no resolution on record. That is the first honest thing to say about where this story ends. Barabbas does not appear in any early Christian document, not in Paul's letters, which name dozens of figures from the early community across multiple cities, not in the Acts of the Apostles, which follows the movement of the early church through Jerusalem and the surrounding regions, not in any apocryphal text with credible early dating. He walked out of that courtyard and disappeared from the historical record as completely as a man can disappear. We don't know how long he lived. We don't know if he returned to the insurgency, to one of the several violent uprisings that marked the decades leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, when the world he had known was reduced to rubble. We don't know if he died of age in some city outside Judea, carrying a history that no one around him knew. We know only this: he lived past Passover of approximately 30 AD, and the text chose not to follow him. That choice is itself worth sitting with. The gospel writers were not interested in what Barabbas did next, because their story was not about Barabbas. Their story was about Jesus. The substitution was theological data, evidence of a pattern, a fulfillment, a meaning that extended far beyond the two men involved. Barabbas was a supporting element in a cosmic narrative. He just didn't know that. From inside his own life, there was no cosmic narrative. There was a courtyard, a crowd, a name called out, a gate opening. There was the rest of a day, and then the rest of a life. And the rest of a life, lived under the weight of that morning, demands something, even at the distance of 2,000 years, that no text was going to provide. It demands a decision. Am I defined by what happened to me, or by what I do with it? That question is not ancient. It arrives for every person who has ever survived something they didn't earn, received something they couldn't repay, or walked away from a situation where someone else absorbed the cost that should have been theirs. The guilt of survival. The weight of a debt that has no institutional process for discharge. The paralysis that comes from receiving something that should have been yours to refuse, but wasn't. Barabbas carried this through the streets of Jerusalem. The city moved around him. Passover winding down, pilgrims beginning their return journeys, the ordinary machinery of the city reasserting itself over the extraordinary events of that week. And because there is no resolution on record, we are left with the most honest kind of ending. Not a transformation into something clean and categorizable. A man carrying something for the rest of his life that he didn't ask for and couldn't put down, making something of it or not, in ways the record simply chose not to preserve. The silence doesn't resolve, but it speaks. And what it says across 2,000 years is something the text never managed to articulate directly. That the weight of being given back your life by someone who shouldn't have had to give it, that weight is not a wound you recover from. It is a question you learn to live inside. Barabbas learned to live inside it, in whatever way he could, for however long he had. There is something about the story of Barabbas that does not stay in the first century. Not because of what it is supposed to mean theologically, but because of what it is structurally. The story of a person who was handed back a life they had already lost, and then had to figure out what to do with the return. That structure is not ancient. Most of us have not been released from Roman custody. But most of us have received something we didn't earn, survived something we shouldn't have, or carried the quiet, persistent awareness that someone else paid a price we were supposed to pay. What we do with that awareness is not a theological question. It is a human one. Barabbas walked into a city that had no idea what he was carrying. He moved through streets full of people processing the same events from entirely different angles. He was invisible at the center of the most significant week in the history of that city. And he was alone with it. That aloneness, that specific weight of carrying something transformative without anyone around you knowing you're carrying it, is recognizable across every generation, every culture, every century between his and ours. The text let him disappear. But the question he was carrying didn't disappear with him. It kept moving. It found its way through 2,000 years of silence and arrived here, in this moment, wherever you are watching from. What do you do with a life that was given back to you? What do you do with something you didn't earn and couldn't refuse? Maybe those questions are already alive in you. Maybe they have been for a long time. The most honest stories are the ones that don't resolve cleanly, that leave you with more questions than answers, that ask something of you rather than giving you something easy to hold. If that's the kind of story you want, subscribe. There are more coming.
Barabbas walked out of that courtyard carrying something no one around him could see. Not guilt, exactly. Something older than guilt. The weight of a life that was given, not earned. He never asked for it. He couldn't return it. He had to live inside it, one ordinary day at a time. If something you heard today stayed with you, if it brought to the surface something you've been carrying for a long time, leave it in the comments. You don't have to carry it alone. Sometimes the heaviest burden isn't the guilt for what we've done. It's the gift we never asked to receive. Barabbas carried that afternoon wherever he went. What you're carrying today deserves a next step too. It doesn't have to be a big one. It just has to be honest.